New York is full of crazy people. It was in the past and it is now. But among the hundreds of headline-grabbing lunatics, there was one who deserves special attention. He hit the streets of the Big Apple in the early 1970s. Unshaven, unwashed, and dressed in a housecoat, he walked the sidewalks of Manhattan, mumbling incoherently to himself. If you saw him for the first time, you'd probably just walk on by without even realizing who this man named Vincent Gigante really was. Meanwhile, this psycho was actually one of the most powerful mob bosses of his generation, who managed to pretend to be insane for almost 30 years and avoided jail while the state turned on Cosa Nostra. While everyone around him was getting prison sentences, he fooled one psychiatrist after another and stayed on the outside to run the strongest mafia family, controlling a large part of New York City's construction, ports, and criminal life on the streets. While every newspaper wrote and every TV station talked about John Gotti, it was Gigante who was the real power of the American Mafia. If you're interested in hearing the story of the mob boss who managed to stay in the shadows better than anyone in history without losing his power, then meet Vincent "Chin" Gigante on the other side of the law. Vincent Gigante was born in New York City in March 1928. His parents named him after their other child who had died of an accident 3 years earlier. Gigante's father, named Salvatore, was a jeweler by trade and provided most of the material needs for the family of 2 adults and 5 children. His mother, Yolanda, helped him as much as she could. She worked part-time in a garment factory and took care of the children's upbringing. The Gigante family, who came to the States in the early 1920s, certainly did not have a life of luxury, but they were not extremely poor. Vincent's childhood and the rest of his life were spent in a neighborhood called Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan, New York. Here he received his nickname, the Chin. His mother affectionately called him Cinzino, which meant Little Vincenzo, taking how the name Vincent sounds in Italian. The boys on the street shortened Cinzino to Chin. Mostly, Vincent's childhood passed, so to speak, without many incidents. He had loving parents who gave him care and shelter. There were 4 brothers who were very friendly among each other. And he even received quite a successful elementary school education before going to high school, where he played on the local American football team. His tendency for crime began to take shape closer to the age of 16. It started with gambling. As recalled by his younger brother Luis, who would later become a priest, in those days Chin began to spend a lot of time playing craps in illegal venues. In a very short time, he went from playing the game to running one of these small spots. Of course, the venue itself did not belong to him, but he fulfilled a hybrid role of administrator and bouncer. A little later in 1945, Gigante would get his first arrest, of which there would be as many as 7 before he turned 25. That time, he was charged with theft and jail was avoided. Such a drastic change in just a couple of years from an ordinary teenager to a young criminal was most likely due to the new acquaintances he made at Stillman's boxing gym. I recently discussed in a separate video the extent to which boxing at that time was under the control of the mafia. Vincent was no exception in this matter. His manager was Thomas Eboli, nicknamed Tommy Ryan, a man close to Vito Genovese, who later became the boss of the family. Gigante first went pro in 1944, but since he was still a minor, he used the birth certificate of the deceased brother he was named after. Chin's boxing career can be called neither successful nor a failure. In total, he held 25 fights. He had 21 victories, 2 of which were by knockout, and he lost 4 times, 1 of which was by knockout. He was never the champion of any division. Vincent stopped fighting in 1947, and it seems that from that moment on, he was fully immersed in crime. That same year, he was arrested for theft and then for setting fire to a car. He got off with a suspended sentence, but in 1950, he finally received his first penalty. Still, it was a minor one: 60 days of community service for participating in organized illegal gambling. Then he was arrested from time to time for gambling or for theft, but they could never prove anything. By the mid-1950s, he was off the police's radar. This was due to the fact that, at the time, young Gigante got noticed by Vito Genovese, then a mafia captain, who took him on as his driver and security guard. Chin could have met Genovese either through Eboli, who had been his manager during his boxing career, or as the FBI claimed, through Frank Alphonse Thierry, who would later assume a high position in the Mafia family's hierarchy. The Bureau claimed that Vincent was close to Thierry, and that Frank shared business interests with Genovese. Chin got with Genovese just as Vito's conflict with a Mafia family boss named Frank Costello was approaching an open confrontation. I talked about this in detail in the videos about Costello and Genovese. In brief, Vito was the family's second man in the 1930s, after then-boss Charles Luciano. But at the end of the decade, he had to flee criminal charges to Italy. When he returned, however, Luciano was already in prison and Costello was running the family. Vito was not satisfied with this, and he started to look for opportunities to oust Frank. Gradually, everything came down to Genovese, who decided to go in on a frontal attack and simply kill Costello. For this job, he chose his chauffeur, Vincent Gigante. In May 1957, Chin waited for Costello in the lobby of his house, and with the words, "This is for you, Frank," pulled the trigger of the gun. The bullet seemed to hit him right in the head, and Costello dropped dead, so Vincent immediately left the building and drove off in a waiting car. In reality, the bullet only grazed his skull, and Costello survived. After the assassination attempt, he agreed to voluntarily step down as boss and retire from the business. Frank did not say that Gigante had shot him. And although the authorities were almost 100% sure that the shooter was Vincent, when he surrendered after a few months on the run, they couldn't do anything to him because Costello claimed he had seen who it was, and it was definitely not Gigante. The subsequent trial, where the authorities still tried to make something stick, also ended with an acquittal without the victim's testimony, since the case was so weak. At the time of the attempt on Costello's life, Vincent was most likely already in the Mafia, as almost all authors identify him as a soldier at the time. And even if not, unfortunately, I haven't found precise data on this point, and we have to determine it by circumstance. The facts were obviously changed soon after the rise of Genovese because the Chin was too close to the family boss and his most trusted associates. On the other hand, once Costello had stepped aside, Vito first took his place as boss, and later was one of the participants in the plot to eliminate another family boss, Albert Anastasia. He would lobby Carlo Gambino to take Albert's place, allowing Genovese to become one of the most powerful bosses in the American Mafia. You can see more about this in my video about Joe Bonanno or Albert Anastasia. In a way, the patronage of such a man in the Mafia was like a calling from heaven for Gigante, like drawing a winning lottery ticket. But on the other hand, this newfound power also attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies, who began to watch Vito closely and look for any opportunity to send him to jail. Chin, who continued to work for Genovese as a driver and security guard, could easily take the fall for the company, so to speak. Which is exactly what happened. The authorities believed that, using his connections in Italy, Vito had organized a network to smuggle heroin into the States. They found a witness named Nelson Cantellops who could confirm this. And even though the case was extremely murky, as you can see in my Genovese video, Vito and more than 10 other people still got prison sentences. Among them was Gigante, who Cantellops characterized as a man close to Genovese and ran his errands, which sometimes included working as a courier to deliver goods to other cities. They gave Vincent 7 years. He got out after 4 years in 1964 for good behavior, and from then on became extremely oppositional about any manifestation of drugs, whether it be their use or trade. When he became boss, he would ban his men under penalty of death from doing business with illegal substances. Though, to be precise, he would continue to uphold the ban imposed by the new head of the family after Genovese was sent to prison. Who exactly was leading the family on the streets during this period is not something we're going to get into in this video, because, at any rate, there were still people loyal to Gigante on the leadership team, which is the only important part for this story. And who exactly sat there in the boss's chair after Genovese, whether it was Eboli or Lombardo, maybe Strollo or even Catena, doesn't matter for today. If you want, you can write your guess in the comments. I'd love to read it. For now, we're more interested in the fact that in the next 6 years, Chin would first rise in the family hierarchy to captain, and second, would begin to play out the show of madness that allowed him to fool law enforcement for almost 30 years. It all started in the late 1960s. That's when he bought a house in Old Tappan Township in Bergen County, New Jersey. There, Gigante got acquainted with Lieutenant Herbert Ulmers from the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, who introduced Vincent to local police chief Charles Shue. And to make the friendship even stronger, Chin would occasionally send Shue postcards filled with $100 bills. This came to light in 1970. Shue was removed from his position, and Gigante faced up to 15 years in prison for bribing an official. In February, the case went to trial, where Vincent paid $25,000 bail to remain free. And in April, Gigante's lawyer informed the court that his client was undergoing psychiatric treatment. So, a man in full health, confirmed by his medical testimony in prison while serving time for drugs, turned psychotic in an instant. The authorities didn't believe him, of course, but they didn't yet know who they were dealing with. Vincent would first visit a psychiatric hospital in April 1970. At the time, he complained of a constant and almost uncontrollable desire to sleep. That's when he would go into treatment. But it wasn't like for everyone else. He had a clause in his contract with the clinic that said he could stop treatment at any time, unilaterally and at will. So, he did, just after his lawyer informed the court of his hospitalization. Then, in September, to keep up his image, he went to the hospital again, this time complaining of a constant feeling of anxiety. His mother and wife, when questioned by doctors about the manifestation of any prior mental abnormalities, started making them up. They claimed that he was afraid of the dark, had constant tantrums, and skipped school due to a bad mood. In the future, stories about his numerous head injuries related to boxing and street fights would be added to this. In principle, more and more facts from the past appeared every year in his medical records that could confirm the current diagnosis. Naturally, it was not enough for the authorities that Gigante had been diagnosed in some clinic. They wanted to see for themselves that he was indeed suffering from schizophrenia and sent their own doctor to see him. More psychiatrists would see Vincent in the future, and he managed to fool them all. And here's what the first doctor who examined him at the request of the authorities recalled. The examination itself took place at Gigante's house. We met him in a blue robe, unshaven and with disheveled hair. I think he had just gotten up by this time. Then we began a conversation. During it, he sat in his chair with a passive, even sleepy expression on his face. Most of the time, he was silent. Sometimes he echoed my questions. For example, when I asked him about medication, he would lazily reply, "Medication, medication." Or when I asked him if he was afraid of anything, he replied, "Afraid, afraid." Everything Gigante said was uttered in a plain, impassive, and monotone voice. At some point during the interrogation, he stood up and quickly left the room. He returned a few minutes later without explaining anything, and simply sat back in his chair, maintaining his impassive presence in the room. In the end, the spectacle paid off. The authorities bought it and put the case on hold. Chin was so good that his lawyers were barely able to dissuade the court from forcing him to undergo electroshock therapy, which was recommended by a psychiatrist who examined Gigante at the authorities' request. Thus began nearly 30 years of duping law enforcement. Nevertheless, it did not prevent Chin from successfully building his career in the mafia. By the early 1980s, he was one of the most authoritative members of the family and one of the main contenders for the role of its new boss. As I said earlier, after Genovese's departure from the business, determining who was the boss gets a little tricky. Some researchers still believe that there was no such boss back then, and decisions were made collectively. If you believe former mafioso Jimmy Fratiano, by the mid-1970s, Gigante was already among those who gave the command. At that time, it was Alphonse Thierry, Phil Lombardo, Anthony Salerno, and yes, Gigante. Who was who, we will not sort out now, as there are several arguments for and against each version, none of which play a role in this video. And the important thing is that by 1981, Thierry died, and Lombardo retired for health reasons. That left the diarchy of Gigante and Salerno. The most widespread version is that before leaving, Lombardo put Gigante as the boss, and Vincent in turn made everyone around consider Salerno the real boss, acting as a puppet master and giving orders from behind the scenes. Whether this is true or not is difficult to say, because they were roughly equal in rank. In addition, Salerno was older than Chin by almost 2 decades, most likely from 1981 to 1986. After Salerno was put in jail, the family continued to be managed by several people, namely Gigante and Salerno, and only after Tony's imprisonment, Chin became a full-fledged boss. However, I want to point out that this is just my take of the events, and you can always write your opinion in the comments. Gigante was doing well in those days, not only in the field of hierarchical regalia, but also in more down-to-earth and relatable matters, namely making money. Of course, he had his interest in illegal gambling, underground extortion, and some clubs and bars. These types of earnings were like daily bread for the mafioso of those years, and Chin was also engaged in them. But what we're interested in now is something bigger and more unusual, something that no one else was doing. And that was Gigante. Gigante had a huge influence on the Roulette record company and label. Louis Armstrong himself was once signed there, and today this firm, which changed its name to Warner Music Group, is one of the leaders in the music industry. Roulette Records, which I'll just call Roulette, was founded in the mid-1950s by a group of enthusiasts, including Maurice Levy, who eventually became the head of the company. Levy was what you might call a street guy, and knew lots of mobsters who in turn knew him. There was even talk that Thomas Eboli gave him money to start the firm. Whether this is true or not, I can't say, but the fact that the Genovese family and Eboli in particular went into business is true. And in time, when the older associates retired or passed away, it was Gigante who became Levy's main patron. Levy himself was the perfect partner for the gangsters. He only cared about 3 things: finding good performers, promoting them, and robbing them of all they had. As musician Tommy James recalled, by the time he managed to get out of roulette, he had stolen about $40 million in royalties. Of course, James wasn't the only one. It should also be said that he was very lucky. Usually, musicians who wanted to leave ended up like Jimmy Rogers, a famous artist from the 1950s who was beaten to a pulp after trying to leave the label. Levy also had 40 retail record stores called Strawberries. Gigante was getting his share from there, too. The next line of income for Chin and the Genovese family was from controlling the docks and labor unions on the New York waterfront. The FBI believed that from this alone, Vincent was making about $2 million a year for himself. This type of income, one might say, was also inherited by Gigante, since control of the docks had been established long before he became boss. The Gambino family controlled Brooklyn, and the Genovese family held Manhattan. Control itself was exercised through the management of the local dockworkers unions. I described in detail how a racket like this works in a video about Louis Buchalter. As recalled by a man who worked at the port at the time, Gigante's men collected $25 for each unloaded container. As you might imagine, that wasn't the only kind of income there. From kickbacks for promoting, stealing and selling various goods, collecting from the movers under various pretexts, and so on, gangsters only needed to use their imaginations to get paid. The second interesting way Chin and the Genovese family made money was the so-called Concrete Club. This was a conspiracy between 4 New York Mafia families to take over the construction industry through labor unions. It would be more accurate to say they conspired after they had already taken over the unions. The real goal was to maximize their profits. Control over labor unions allowed the Mafia to stop almost every construction site in New York with the help of strikes, making it impossible to work in the industry in those years without them. Here's what FBI agent Jules Bonavolonta, who worked on the case, recalled about it. For any cement work in New York worth more than $2 million, only 6 firms were allowed to bid, and they were pre-selected by the Mafia. In return for the privilege to bid, these firms were to pay the Colombo, Gambino, Lucchese, and Genovese families 2% for each contract. Another operation which Chin took part in that was construction-related was the so-called window scam. In the late 1970s, New York City's Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development launched a program to reduce heating costs in public housing by installing new windows. And it just so happened that 4 mafia families controlled all the regions for this scheme. Gambino and Colombo had the window manufacturing companies, while Genovese and Lucchese managed the workers' unions that were necessary for direct installation. What's more, they were able to get contracts for 151 of the available $191 million by various tricks such as bribing officials and rigging bids, through the participation of only mafia-controlled firms. And most of the contracts that the mafia could not get directly, it monetized indirectly by terrorizing the companies that were supposed to install the windows. They received $2 from them for each installed window, and those who refused to pay were regularly deprived of their windows. Some unidentified hooligans would smash all of them, from the warehouses where they were stored to the buildings where they were already installed. In all, in terms of Gigante's particularly large income, that was it. However, it was not only in the field of making money that he thrived. The period when he was boss was characterized by a large number of defectors who later spoke willingly to both the authorities and the press. And they all claimed that Vincent was probably the most authoritative boss of that generation. They described him as a tough but smart guy. That image clearly began to take shape long before he became boss. The same Maurice Levy recalled that already in the 1960s, when he introduced Thomas Eberle to Chin, Eberle respectfully called him Mr. Gigante, something Levy had not often heard from him. But for the first time, this very toughness, as well as a mind that was as cunning as a fox, could be observed in all its glory when Gigante, along with the rest of the heads of the Genovese family, provoked a coup in the Philadelphia family. Genovese wanted to take a bite out of gambling in Atlantic City, which became legal there in 1976. But local boss Angelo Bruno opposed it in every possible way. Then, Alphonse Thierry took advantage of the disagreement between Bruno and his consigliere Antonio Caponigro, hinting to the latter that the commission wouldn't mind eliminating Bruno. The commission, if anyone doesn't know, is the central body for resolving disputes in the American Mafia. Caponigro fell for it and killed Bruno. The Genoveses took advantage of that and made it look like Caponigro was the only guilty party. Vincent Gigante volunteered to punish him and show everyone what happens when you kill the boss without the approval of the commission. You can Google how exactly the murder was committed. It's better not to tell it on YouTube, much less to show it. After Caponigro was eliminated, a Genovese loyalist took over the Philadelphia family. Technically, the Genovese leader did not violate any Cosa Nostra rules here, and actually came out of the situation as their protector. As Phil Leonetti, a Philadelphia family member who eventually became a government witness, recalled, Caponigro was told he needed to settle the Bruno issue. And when the issue was resolved, Thierry began stating, "So-and-so meant to sit down and talk, not do this whole thing." In the future, when Chin would become the boss of the family, he would act no less cleverly and harshly. Rule breakers, especially snitches, were punished swiftly and without second thought. The most famous cases are the murders of Jerry Papa, who committed 2 unauthorized murders of members of another family, and Nat Maselli, who was secretly cooperating with the authorities. But the most characteristic event where Gigante acted as a defender of Cosa Nostra's rules was the revenge against John Gotti for the unauthorized murder of his boss, Paul Castellano, and taking over the Gambino family. You can hear about the reasons for Gotti's actions in my video about him or his underboss, Salvatore Gravano. Today, however, we'll look at these events from a different perspective. For Gotti, Castellano's murder was an either-or situation. For Gigante, it was a violation of the rules that gave him power. Plus, Vincent was on good terms and had a common business interest with Castellano. The last thing that drove Chin to revenge was that he and Gotti were 2 very different types of gangsters. Gotti never understood why Gigante spent most of his life playing crazy, and Vincent was pissed that John was acting like a superstar, attracting more attention than the President of the United States. Chin didn't attack head-on, however. He was more cunning, pretending to believe that Gotti didn't know who shot Paul. Gigante lay low and began to prepare a plan. The original scheme was to blow up Gotti in a car with his deputy, Frankie DeCicco, but the plan didn't work because coincidentally, only DeCicco was in the car. Then there were several more attempts, but all of them failed. John was incredibly lucky. For a long time, Gotti didn't even think about Chin because he considered him an ardent follower of Cosa Nostra's rules, and they forbade the use of bombs, which Chin used in assassination attempts. However, in 1987, FBI agents came to his house and told him that they had learned about a new hit attempt on him from a wiretap and hinted at who was preparing it. In case you don't know, in the United States, the authorities are obligated to report a threat on a person's life, no matter how the information got to them and no matter who that person is. Gotti, however, could not start a war based solely on the agent's words, and he had no other evidence. The only thing he could do was to try to get Gigante to come clean in a face-to-face meeting. But Vincent was such a skillful liar that Gotti didn't stand a chance. After this incident, Chin changed his tactics. He first lay low for a while and then started hitting the cronies, but not Gotti himself, to confuse the Gambino family boss. That's how Eddie Lino and Bobby Borriello were killed. It was also done because Gigante was going to put a Gambino family man named James Fila in his place after Gotti's death. And wiping out Gotti's entourage was also necessary so that when Fila was at the helm, no one would oppose him. However, Vincent was never able to materialize his plan. The authorities had gotten to Gotti first, and soon they would get to Chin himself, so he would be out of the Mafia's political game. Ever since Gigante had first played the insanity card, he never stopped following his story for a day. It wasn't as if Chin was walking around quietly under surveillance like a normal person, but as soon as he faced prosecution, he'd start feigning insanity. The simulation was frequent. He was supposedly treated at a clinic every year, constantly walking around his home neighborhood in his trademark robe and slippers, mumbling something under his breath, and sometimes performing inappropriate acts like defecating in public. And also, what he seemed to enjoy the most was putting on a show for the authorities, who occasionally put him under watch or came to his house under various pretexts. Oh yeah, and Chin was officially living with his mother, who was supposedly taking care of him. So, on one such visit, FBI agents caught him standing naked under a running shower, where he was sheltering himself with an umbrella. On the streets, when Vincent noticed surveillance, he might talk to trees or parking meters for long periods of time, or he might fall to his knees and start praying. But even he wasn't able to detect in time that he was being watched, which often led to funny incidents. Like one day, he started yelling at a neighbor who was being impeded by Chin's car and started honking his horn. But as soon as he caught sight of the watching agents, he instantly lowered his tone and turned back into a half-hunched psycho, even though a few seconds before he was a healthy, aggressive man. Another time, he and his companion were forced to cross the road through a dense stream of cars. They quickly ran to the other side of the street like football players, dodging their opponents, and once on the sidewalk, he turned back into a barely mobile, psychotic man with his companion. But these were all one-off blunders that had no effect on the overall act, rather than catastrophic failures. Gigante played the psycho card very well indeed. Moreover, he made sure that no one inside the Mafia would give up his story either. He banned his name from being used in conversation. Instead, to refer to him, the person could only touch their chin. It was so serious that if Vincent found out that his name had been used, a message would be sent to the person. If they were caught on tape with Gigante's name in it, they were dead. Chin also stopped other mobsters from trying to play the lunatic. I guess the logic here was that if there were too many crazies around, the authorities would surely take it more seriously. On that note, it even went so far that there was once another gangster who ran outside at night in his bathrobe to meet his girlfriend, and the next day got a call from Gigante's men warning him not to do it again. However, no matter how hard he tried to play the crazy card perfectly and run the Mafia family in parallel, it was impossible to do so without a slip-up, and not just the kind I described earlier. And each mistake only convinced the authorities to continue pursuing Gigante. It started with suspicions that the Chin was playing them. The FBI had no direct confirmation of this, but there were rumors that needed to be checked out. So when a massive mob crackdown started in the 1980s, Gigante came under scrutiny as well. He was put under surveillance, which only confirmed the theory of a sham. I'm talking about those little slip-ups mentioned earlier, and others like them. Then, agents caught Vincent actually having two families. He was alternating between living with one and the other. And since Chin wasn't aware that both houses were being watched, the agents saw through the apartment window how competent Vincent really was. There was no question of any mental disorder, certainly not the kind he'd shown psychiatrist. He was just an ordinary man, spending time with his wife and children. He wasn't even wearing his usual robe. This was the final confirmation to the authorities that Gigante was fooling them mercilessly. However, now they had to prove it. Mere evidence that he was behaving appropriately with his family was definitely not enough. The FBI first tried to infiltrate Gigante's inner circle of confidants through which he conducted most of his business, to pry confirmation from them of Chin's normality. However, none of the foursome of Venero Mangano, Dominic Churillo, Dominic Cantarino, and Bobby Mana said a word. Authorities then tried to tap Gigante's phones, but he either said nothing that could expose his charade or prove criminal involvement, or he whistled into the receiver the whole time. As the agents later learned, it was a special cipher, but they were never able to solve it. The installation of bugs into Chin's social club called Triangle was also unsuccessful. All of these actions by the authorities occurred alongside a series of other investigations that would lead to a trial unofficially called the Commission Case, where the bosses of New York's mafia families were convicted. Instead of Gigante, it would be Anthony Salerno who would go to prison in 1986. By then, authorities had not yet obtained sufficient evidence that the Chin was sane and running the family, but they continued on. The Commission's case was largely built on numerous tapes of conversations between other families' bosses, and Chin's name was repeatedly seen there. It was not the beginning of the end, however. Vincent remained in the relative shadows for about 2 more years, until a man once close to Salerno named Vincent Cafaro spoke up. He appeared before a Senate committee, as Valachi once had, and told everything he knew about the workings of the New York Mafia, and especially the Genovese family. Cafaro named Gigante as the boss of the family, who, according to him, never suffered from any mental illness, and all this was nothing more than a farce to avoid prosecution by the authorities. And following Cafaro, Peter Savino, the man in charge of the family's window scam, also defected to the authorities. For several months, Savino carried a microphone and recorded all the conversations of his former associates, forming the basis of the criminal prosecution, which included Gigante. In May 1990, he made his first court appearance in the case, wearing his lunatic uniform, which meant only one thing. Even with the evidence, even with the rebuke from Cafaro some time before, the Chin was going to play the mental illness card again. This time, the authorities scheduled him for a checkup with 4 psychiatrists. It lasted for 9 months, took a total of 30 hours, and what do you think it resulted in? Yes, he was again declared unfit to stand trial due to serious mental illness. And perhaps after this victory, Gigante could indeed go down in history as the man who cheated the law by pretending to be insane. However, the number of defectors who could confirm that he was actually sane increased every year, allowing authorities to revisit the Chin's case in new attempts to expose him. The next indictment caught up with Vincent in 1993. This time, in addition to the charges of the window scam, there were conspiracies to kill Caponegro and Papa, an attempt to organize the murder of Savino, as well as acts committed during the revenge against Gotti. As a side dish, there were accusations of extortion and union-related scams. The authorities learned all this from recent defectors by way of Alphonse Darco, Phil Leonetti, and Salvatore Gravano. These same defectors were the nail in the coffin after years of acting. Their testimony convinced the judge that Gigante was faking an illness, after which the psychiatrist who examined Vincent admitted that they could be wrong, and the defendant may well continue to participate in the trial. Chin nevertheless continued to play the role of a madman throughout the proceedings, which for the first time did not help him. In 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He was found guilty of racketeering and participating in 2 murders. When he got to prison, he was almost 70 years old, but he still continued to run his family from behind bars. He didn't give up pretending either. From time to time, he'd act out visions and voices in his head. Then he'd say he was fine, and then he'd put on a show again. All this lasted until 2003, when a racketeering and obstruction of justice case went to trial. Vincent was accused of swindling the authorities for years by faking illness and continuing to run the family by giving orders through his son, Andrew. The prosecution this time had excellent evidence of the racketeering, and the case against his act was practically foolproof. On the second case, his son could have faced a big sentence as an accessory in the end. So Vincent decided to plead guilty in exchange for ending the prosecution of everyone else involved in the charge. On April 7, 2003, in a packed courtroom, Chin admitted that he'd been deceiving the authorities all along, for which he received an additional 3 years in prison. His son, on the other hand, was sentenced to 2 years and fined $2.5 million for racketeering and extortion. Back in prison, Gigante was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Although he was free of mental illness, his physical health was not so great for the 70-something mob boss. He had suffered from heart and kidney failure. Chin lasted only 2 more years there, and in 2005, he left this world in a prison bed.